Okay, we're continuing with the ancient Greeks. This is part 7. The first painting here is about Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was, the first vegetarian. They used to call the vegetarian diet the Pythagorean diet. He, of course, put in a lot of emphasis on mathematics, the Pythagorean theorem. He also was famous for the idea that he felt that animals have souls that were related to reincarnation and that a human might be reincarnated as an animal. So nobody should kill an animal. It might have the soul of a human. Okay, so this is one nice painting by Peter Paul Rubens of Pythagoras and some of his followers. They used to stand out by the sun and praise the sun, and they'd also, enjoy the health benefits of being out in the sun and making music. He also helped figure out the octaves on the musical instrument. There's Demosthenes. He was one of the great speakers. He actually came a little bit later in the history of Greece, but he would practice speaking out by the water. He had been robbed of his inheritance when he was young, and he didn't have enough money to get somebody to support him legally, so he had to defend himself. And he initially was a poor speaker, but he developed his talents and his delivery that he became a great speaker, an orator, and able to argue for his legal rights. Here is just some of the building of Athens called the Flowering of Greece. And you see how they're stacking up these round metal drums to make the columns with their buildings like the Parthenon and whatnot. They're looking down on everything because they're up in the Acropolis. So it's rather beautiful. And, most of what's good in Western civilization came, not most of it, but a tremendously large amount of it came from ancient Greece. Lots of great Greek plays like Sophocles' version of Oedipus Rex, Antigone's great. There's a whole bunch of great ones. The Greeks loved the theater. And so, again, theater, literature, philosophy, all this stuff really started in Greece. Okay, here's the great Acropolis, and you can see the statue of Athena, the Parthenon up there, and you're looking up from, it's called Pnyx Hill. It's just beautiful. The mountains, the ocean, it's all quite beautiful. Here's the ruins of the Parthenon, and like I said, there should be a picture of the Parthenon, Jacques Berzon. There should be one in every classroom. You can't know Western history without knowing the Greeks. The Greeks started everything that we would consider modern history in terms of, free speech, free debate, men with individual autonomy rather than ruled by some controlling ruler. Paintings by Frederick Edwin Church. And that architecture was, copied and improved upon by the Romans and later by the Americans and others. Pericles' funeral oration, on Pnyx Hill in front of the Acropolis up there, during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which was a big disaster. One of the reasons why countries collapse is because the people are not unified, okay? The Greeks should all be sticking together, just like when they had defeated the Persians in about 480 BC. It's because they were unified there. Sparta and Athens were helping each other. But once Sparta and Athens started fighting with each other, splitting the whole Greek territories apart, then Greek became weak. They were conquered by Macedon, and later by Rome. But anyways, Pericles was the leading statesman of Athens at the time of Athens' peak, the golden age of Athens, in the early 400s BC. And here, of course, is Aspasia, his courtesan, highly educated girlfriend that he really liked. And again, the beautiful Acropolis, the ocean out here, the surrounding land. It's all very nice. Aspasia talking with philosophers. Perhaps that's Socrates right there. And engineers. The Greeks had lots of real smart people. They were educated. They were, the Europeans were still barbarians at this time, walking around illiterate in the woods, whereas the Greeks had all this high civilization. Socrates, Pericles, and Aspasia. Okay, the Peloponnesian War was a disaster for the history of ancient Greece. Okay, it basically broke the thing in half, kind of like what the Protestant Reformation did to Europe in the 1500s. The Peloponnesian War was a civil war between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides had been like an admiral in the Athenian army, and he disgraced himself by not doing something that he was supposed to, and he was sort of then, not somewhat ostracized from the main contingent of the Athenian military. So he was a close observer and a well-informed person on events, so he decided to write a history of the Peloponnesian War. And it's a magnificent book, and one of the things he says is, my book is not for the flattery, the pleasure of the moment. It is for all time, that men might know, why people have war and what really happens. So I remember having to read that book my freshman year of college. It was great. Okay, here it is. Yeah, here's one of the quotes from Thucydides. My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever. And he talks about things like what happened in Milos. So Milos is one of the great shames of Athens. The people of Milos, the Mylians, they were afraid that they were going to have allegiance to Sparta, so Athens put a lot of pressure on them to surrender and accept the rule. They wanted to sort of stay out of things, and they refused to give unconditional surrender to Athens, and Athens just sort of devastated them, which was a very cruel and unnecessary thing, but it kind of shows you how things can be during a war. It's all very bad. Euripides, one of the great playwrights. The language of truth is simple. They don't have all these competitions to see who could perform and write the best play. Euripides often won those contests. Okay, and then here is Sophocles, the playwright. And so having these plays was a big deal in ancient Athens. Phidias was a great sculptor, and he's showing people the Parthenon, the statues that he has like up high towards the ceiling when they're doing construction. Here's Lost Illusions, a painting by Charles Gleyre, public domain, and sort of the sadness of a man when he's separated by his family. On the one hand, a man thinks his family kind of noisy, kind of annoying, kind of expensive, but on the other hand, he loves them. Okay, he really does. Because for a man, life's a little bit bleak. We just work all the time. It's nice to have women and kids around with all their silliness. Oh, this is just some other historical stuff about Thucydides, by the way. He wrote about the plague in Athens. He wrote about all the events of the Peloponnesian War and, the things that happened also in Syracuse and stuff with Alcibiades and whatnot. It's a great book. Never forget what happened in Milos, though. That's very educational. Okay, now here's a lady that's just sort of a sideshow of silliness in ancient Athens. Her name was Phryne, and she was sort of like the most beautiful courtesan woman in Athens of the time. Heterae is another name for courtesans, educated women who are not wives. Sometimes they're outsiders, they're not citizens of Athens. And she was dancing in the buff at a festival of Poseidonia, in Eleusis, as part of the Eleusinian mysteries. And that was a little bit scandalous back in those days. Then she later walked into the sea without her clothes on, so everybody's looking at her, and she was very beautiful. And then she got in trouble later because she was the model. Well, she wanted to be the model for making the statue, Aphrodite or Venus of Knidos. This statue here is a Roman copy of the Greek original by the great Greek sculptor Praxiteles. So Phryne, the most beautiful woman in Athens, was the model for the statue. And that was considered a sacrilege in Athens at that time, that she was aspiring to be an immortal goddess. She was actually arrested and had to undergo trial at the Athenian court, the Areopagus court. And it seemed at one point that she was guaranteed to be convicted. Then her lawyer had the brilliant idea that he could disrobe her, take her clothes off in front of all the male judges, and let them see how beautiful she really was. And she was the most beautiful woman in Athens, that she was worthy of being the model for Venus, and that it would be an even bigger sin to convict her. And so here's the famous painting of it by Jean Gérôme in 1861. And when the judges saw her, she was so beautiful, they felt she was worthy of being the model to paint Venus. And they felt it would be an even bigger evil if they were to imprison her or kill her. And so she was set free. So that's Phryne at the Areopagus, and her negotiation tactic that worked very well to get her let off scot-free. And I'm just showing you kind of some of the silliness that was happening in Athens, besides all the serious philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Here's Diogenes, known as the homeless philosopher. And he lived in the street, and he was walking around Athens with a candle saying, I'm looking for one honest man in Athens. Couldn't find one honest man. Here's Diogenes in his little crappy little hole that he lives in as a homeless person. He was very clever and funny. When people would ask him questions, he'd give smart aleck answers. Here's another picture of Diogenes in his little homeless shelter there. So the classic story is Alexander the Great had come by, and he said to Diogenes, Diogenes, I will grant you any wish that you have. And so he says, what do you wish for? Diogenes says, I wish that you would get out of my sun. Okay, so that's it for this session of Greek and Athenian art, paintings of them and their history. Hope that was interesting for you.